Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome inside the beautiful Radio Laurier Studios here on Wilfrid Laurier's Waterloo campus, but airing internationally to anyone listening. If you're just listening to some music and my voice popped on, I do apologize, but I'm glad you can be here. I hope you stay with me here as it's Gold in Bold, the sound, the voice, the show of Laurier sports, as well as local sports and professional sports. But we cover a lot of athletic competition here on the show, of course. Away from sports, it's a big weekend here for Laurier. It's a St. Patrick's Day weekend, of course. Pass the flowing bowl over while there's whiskey in the jar, and we'll sing to all the lassies at the Jolly Roving Tar. Make sure to listen to some great Irish music too. I'm a big Irish music fan, so Irish Rovers and the Clancy Brothers, Dubliners, Chieftains, Pogues, Flog and Molly, Dropkick Murphys, Van Morrison, even. All of them are Irish. All of them are very good. So make sure to tune in some Irish music. But it's time for Gold and Bold. Of course, we'll open up with Laurier sports. Of course, most sports seasons are winding down here on campus. Doesn't mean any news hasn't been broken or anything like that. Of course, big news coming out of the women's hockey program here, the Lady Golden Hawks on the ice. A couple awards to be handed out to the team from the OUA. And of course, as mentioned last week, the women's hockey team fell to the Waterloo Warriors, swept in the opening round of the OUA playoffs for the second year in a row by the Waterloo Warriors, who are now facing off for the Macaw Cup tomorrow night at home. They'll be taking on U of T Varsity Blues. We'll get to all the OUA playoff scenes, but again, out of the women's hockey program, we have some rookie team announcements. Sarah Howell, stellar goaltender for the latter half of the season for the Golden Hawks, as well as the Golden Hawks' leading scorer Clara Chisholm, making the OUA all-rookie team. Of course, Ariel McDonald, the fourth-year graduating assistant captain, of course, a stalwart on the blue line for as long as I've covered the team. Ariel McDonald, she becomes the first Laurier recipient to receive OUA's True Sport Award, exemplifying sportsmanship, leadership, and ability. Of course, the Rookie of the Year, not even the rookie team, Rookie of the Year in OUA women's hockey goes to Clara Chisholm. What a season she had. What an inaugural campaign. And what a season for all of the Golden Hawks, as, of course, their coach gets in on the action. Coach of the Year, Kelly Patton, of course, named OUA Women's Hockey Coach of the Year. She's no stranger to coaching accolades. Of course, she's been the coach called upon internationally, of course, to coach Canada's University women's hockey team internationally in the university games, the FISU games. So, of course, Kelly Patton, no secret that she's one of the strongest coaches in the OUA. In women's hockey, she gets Coach of the Year. Elsewhere in Laurier athletics news, the swimming team is in action. Of course, it's the days, day 1, day 2. So it's around day 3 of the U Sports, it's National University Sports swimming competition. Of course, Johnny Avila's bronze medal, of course, yesterday breaks a 24-year drought for Wilfrid Laurier University. 24 years without a medal at U Sports swimming competition is broken by Johnny Avila. Congratulations to him as the opening races started. Day 1, day 2, we got a medal, and day 3 here. We'll get more news coming out of it, and we'll recap it next week, of course. And again, it is St. Patrick's Day weekend here in the region, which is always exciting. Always very exciting, of course. It might be a memorable St. Patty's weekend. Of course, you've been living under a rock. There's a court injunction for Waterloo Regional Police Services. Of course, they can now use more tools to quell unsanctioned street gatherings. So that'll be fines for attending a street gathering, up to $25,000 for just attending, $50,000 for hosting, $25,000 for attending. That's about $26,000 more than I have in my bank account. So there's that. Nonetheless, of course, last week, regular listeners of our show, I know there's so many of you. We covered NHL Trade Deadline, and on that show, I said, I'll eat my shoe if Marchand gets traded. He got traded about as soon as we went off air. So I'm here with my shoe now. It's just, what a deadline that was. It seems each year the trade deadline always gets way more hype in the NHL than it actually comes out with. But this year, it met the hype, of course. Just to recap, Mikko Rantanen, top 5 winger in the league. I'd argue a top 15 player overall. Blockbuster trade. He's involved in the second blockbuster trade this season. Of course, he was on the Avalanche. Contract negotiations stalled. And Avalanche flipped him to the Hurricanes. And then the rumor has it, there's back and forth between the Hurricanes organization and Rantanen. Hurricanes say he didn't want to stay. Rantanen says, I was open to staying. So only time will tell which side we can trust. But Hurricanes not getting a contract done with Rantanen and flip him to the Dallas Stars, who do end up getting that contract done. So he will be a Dallas Star for the next 8 years. So we're signing an 8-year contract out of Texas. He gets up to the Dallas Stars, and Dallas just increases their strength and looks like a dangerous team. And they've been a dangerous team for a bit now. But the addition of Rantanen is just, I think, really sets them as one of, if not the favorite to come out of the West in the NHL trade, NHL playoffs. It's a tough look in the West because Dallas gets Rantanen, loses Stankoven a couple picks, which is a fair price to pay. I think it's a fair trade. I don't think Dallas won that completely. I don't think Carolina won that completely. It's a fair trade. But you think of the Western Conference NHL teams, I would say the Dallas Stars have the best chance of coming out of that conference into the Stanley Cup Finals. We think of other contending teams. Minnesota Wild has looked scary at times when they're all healthy, but they've been only healthy for about maybe 2 hours this entire season. It seems every game, some key player, some role player is out. Kaprizov's been out. Spurgeon's been out. Foligno's been out. A lot of Eriksson Ek has been out. A lot of top players for this team has been out. Should they become all healthy and all 100% by the playoffs, the Wild could be a very hard out in the postseason. But Stars, I think they've got it. Oilers, of course, Stanley Cup Finals. Last year, lose in Game 7 after almost pulling up a legendary comeback in the finals. They came out of the West last year. I wouldn't be, if someone said they favored the Oilers coming out of the West, I wouldn't argue that. However, Oilers beat the Stars last year in the playoffs. I just think the Stars are more experienced. Last year in the playoffs, Stars were a lot more banged up than the Oilers, as is a common in long playoff runs in the NHL. But something about the Stars, I think they can make a deep run. The Golden Knights, of course, always in the action. Strong team, won Stanley Cup champions just a few short years ago. You can never really count out McKinnon in the Avalanche. McKinnon, Makar, Taves. Landeskog, doesn't seem like he's going to come back ever. So you can't really group Landeskog in that conversation anymore. Of course, Avalanche lose Rantanen. Of course, they gain Natchez from the Hurricanes, which is no slouch of a player in his own right. Taking a look at the NHL Western Conference standings. And of course, the Jets, the Winnipeg Jets, I want them to do really well. However, they have yet to be to a Stanley Cup final. I think that's where I'm worried. They haven't shown that they can make a deep playoff run. They made it to the Western Conference Finals, I think 2018, when Washington won. Of course, Vegas beating Winnipeg in the Western Conference Finals, only to be beat by the Capitals. That was 7 years ago. A lot of roster turnover. And didn't even make it to the Stanley Cup Finals, just the Western Conference Finals. I want the Jets to go far. I like the Jets a lot more than the Oilers. If a Canadian team goes far, I want it to be the Jets. However, I just don't have that confidence, especially after last playoff round. Last year, Connor Hellebuyck letting in, I think, 5 or more goals like in every game, getting just romped by the Avalanche in the opening round in 5 games. However, the Jets are on top of the league. They're first in the league. I just worry about their playoffs. However, they can surprise me. They can make a deep playoff run. I'd be more than happy. I like the Jets. I just don't have the confidence in the Winnipeg Jets that I do in the likes of the Dallas Stars, the Golden Knights, the Oilers. And I'd put it's tough. Avalanche or Jets going on a deep playoff run. The Jets are a stronger team. You can't count out playoff Nathan McKinnon. That being said, out of nowhere recently, I say out of nowhere, they're on a 4-game winning streak, and they've just squeaked into the second place in the Pacific Division, the LA Kings, who have been perennial first-round exits for the last couple years, typically at the hands of the Edmonton Oilers. They've squeaked it up past the Oilers in the standings. They're at 79 points, second in the Pacific, while the Oilers are at 78. The wild card scene in the NHL Western Conference is also interesting. The Flames, my team, are currently in the mix. Of course, the Wild firmly onto that first wild card spot in the conference. It's a duel between the Flames and the Canucks, and potentially the Utah Hockey Club, which is maybe my favorite professional name, and the St. Louis Blues. Of course, that's 4 teams fighting for one position. Currently, the Flames have it with 71 points and have it on the tiebreaker. The Canucks also have 71 points. And Utah and the Blues both have 69 points. That's just one win away, one regulation win away, or overtime win, one win. So that's a tight race. The West. Of course, as I mentioned, I do think the Stars have the best chance of coming out of the Western Conference, turning direction to the East, of course, where a lot of trades were made last week, including the aforementioned Marchand trade. Hello. As well as trades, Boston getting rid of a lot of their veteran players. Boston getting rid of Brad Marchand, Charlie Coyle, Justin Brazeau, and Brandon Carlo. Charlie Coyle, Brandon Carlo. I get those 2 last names mixed up. Of course, Brandon Carlo, of course, staying within, not even the Eastern Conference, staying within the division, going to the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course, Brandon Carlo has been a bane in the existence of Leafs in the playoffs. Of course, remember last year, Brandon Carlo was stellar in that series. But the price for Brandon Carlo, I don't know if it's worth the trade. As much as I think Brandon Carlo is a great player, Toronto had to give up top prospect Fraser Minton, a top 5 protected first-round pick, as well as a 4th-round pick. Now, of course, the Bruins do retain 50% of Carlo's contract, but that's not 15, by the way. I didn't say 50, which is significant. 15, which is not too much. And Carlo doesn't have a team crippling contract or anything like that, so I guess that's what the 4th rounder was for. But giving up Fraser Minton, arguably, probably easy a top 3 prospect for the Leafs, probably just behind Easton Cowan, and a top 5 protected first-round pick. I don't know if... I guess, Leafs are making the move now. They need tested players to make deep playoff runs while they still have Matthews, while they still have Marner, while they still have Tavares and Riley and Nylander and all these players in their prime. I understand that. It's a shame you're giving up one of your best prospects and a first-rounder. Of course, Bruins also letting go of Charlie Coyle versus a centerman and a 5th-round pick heading to the Avalanche. And the Bruins get back Casey Middlestat, William Zellers, my favorite store, and a 2nd-round pick, which I don't understand this trade. I like Casey Middlestat. He was struggling on a Buffalo Sabres team last year, then he gets flipped to Colorado, And he was doing good at Colorado. He wasn't like a point-producing machine. He wasn't a McKinnon. He wasn't a Rantanen, or anything like that. But yeah, I thought he was doing well in Avalanche. And I like Middlestat. But Avalanche obviously saw an improvement over Middlestat as Middlestat, the centerman, gets traded for Charlie Coyle, another centerman. So obviously the Avalanche feels Coyle is the better option of the two. And they also give up a second rounder and William Zellers for Charlie Coyle along with Middlestat. So, and Bruins getting rid of their veteran players. However, they're not getting bad returns for them. I think it'd be worse if they got bad returns for Lex Coyle and Carlo. But they're getting good returns. But that good return conversation stops when they get only a second-round pick for Brad Marchand, your captain. Person who's bled black and gold for the Bruins. Brad Marchand gets traded to the Florida Panthers for a conditional second-round pick. That being said, Bruins retained 50% of Marchand's contract. But you're retained 50% and give up the player, and you only get a conditional second-round pick in 2027, in 2 years? That's a astonishing return, quite frankly. Marchand, you couldn't even get a first round. You have to settle for a conditional second round while still retaining half of his contract. I question what Don Sweeney and Cam Neely were cooking up in the kitchen over in Massachusetts. Other trades to go over. A lot of these trades, which was annoying, a lot of these trades came in. The show last week was from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Each week, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. is Golden Bolt Sports Show. Fun. Listen in. Thank you. All that fun stuff. But a lot of these trades came in not only after 2, and the trade deadline ends at 3. So the show ended an hour before the trade deadline, but typically nothing really happens an hour before the trade deadline, 4 to 3 p.m. cutoff, because teams want to get things done beforehand to make sure it goes through. Not this year. A lot of trades not only happens in the space between 2 and 3, but all these trades finally got reported and finalized well into the evening. I thought it was a hard deadline, 3 p.m. I guess there's just such a backlog of trades and transactions that these trades finally got reported way after 3 p.m. into the night, into dinner time. So I didn't even get the chance to cover them last week. And so the official trade calls are coming in. I'm scrolling. The last official trade call was made at 8:30. The trade deadline is at 3 p.m. But they finally got through all the trades at 8:30. That's 5 hours after the deadline. So just it shows how active each team was at the deadline. Of course, notable trades coming after that deadline. Of course, Leafs were involved in getting a 5th rounder for Connor Dewar and Connor Timmins. Of course, goes to the Penguins, both familiar with Kyle Dubas, the manager of the Pittsburgh Penguins, because Kyle Dubas was the manager of Toronto Maple Leafs just not a short while ago. Of course, Connor Timmins, Connor Dewar, of course, under Dubas's tenure of the Leafs, now find themselves under Dubas's tenure on the Penguins. Of course, Devils get Daniel Sprong for a 7th rounder. Of course, Daniel Sprong coming from the Seattle Kraken. I like Daniel Sprong. I think he's worth much more than the 7th rounder. But I'm also not a NHL general manager. So what do I know? Elsewhere, Detroit Red Wings acquire goaltender Peter Mrazek. If you know anything about Peter Mrazek, I'm going to leave it at that. From Chicago, show gets Joe Veleno, a fine depth player from Red Wings, from the Red Wings. The Red Wings in that exchange. Of course, the Jets gain Brandon Tanev from the Seattle Kraken for a 2nd rounder. I think that's a good trade for both sides. Winnipeg Jets also gain Luke Schenn for 2nd and a 4th from the Penguins. I like Luke Schenn a lot, so I'm glad the Winnipeg Jets picked them up. Does Luke Schenn change the needle? Does Brandon Tanev change the needle to where I'm now really confident in them going to the playoffs? No. However, I'm a bit more. I really like Luke Schenn. Of course, Winnipeg Jets atop of the West. Of course, and top of the league, but tied with them for top of the league, of course, is the East's Washington Capitals, which really came out of nowhere. after squeaking into the playoffs last year. Something about this season just clicked everywhere in the lineup for the Washington Capitals. They're on top of the East. They're tied with Winnipeg for the league lead with 94 points with 18 games left to play. So you expect them to get into the 110, maybe 120 point region. In the Atlantic Division, of course, the Panthers are top of that. And the Atlantic Division is just stacked. I don't care who you are. Panthers, Maple Leafs, Lightning, top three. Senators in that first wild card position. Couldn't even contend for that third Atlantic spot, currently occupied by the Lightning, 4 points ahead. Then, of course, the Canadiens, that division, 1 point away from the final wild card position. Red Wings are 2 points away from that wild card position. So are the Bruins. The Sabres, we just don't talk about the Sabres. They're never in that conversation come March and April. You've got to do something about that in Buffalo. They've yet to figure it out. They've missed the playoffs. Buffalo Sabres, they've missed the playoffs. Last 14 years. Last made the playoffs in 2011. You know who was on that roster? The likes of Ryan Miller. The likes of Jason Palmanville. The likes of Thomas Vanek. None of those players are around anymore. That's how far along ago it was. 14 years since the Sabres made the playoffs. And each year we think maybe it's the year. Each year we think, okay, they made some good moves. And it just doesn't click. No matter which coach they have, no matter which general manager they have, there's something about that jersey, something about playing in Buffalo that just did not click for a hockey team. They have yet to see any success, any good, decent success, really, since the Hasek years of the late 90s. Even like someone like the Leafs at least have something regular season to write home about. They at least had Matthews hit 69 goals, get that Hart Trophy. They at least have promising teams. They've won the division. Sabres, they made the playoffs. The Sabres haven't even made the playoffs in 14 years and had nothing to really to write home about much at all. But outside the Sabres, the other 7 teams in Atlantic Division all could be in the playoffs. Now, all won't be due to the playoff format, but from 1 to 7, Panthers, Maple Leafs, Lightning, Senators, Canadiens, Red Wings, Bruins, especially Senators, Canadiens, Red Wings, Bruins, all of them could make the playoffs, and you wouldn't really bat an eye. Bruins would be a bit strange because they sold at the deadline. Sometimes you sold and bought, but they mostly sold their veteran players. So you don't really see the Bruins making the playoffs. But again, they're right there with the Red Wings, who are 2 points away from the playoff line. It will be interesting to see how that Atlantic Division peters out. Of course, the Red Wings, notably, they were riding a 6-game losing streak in this month. Of course, they won their last game. But the Detroit Red Wings looked really promising. They were in a wild card spot. And then comes the month of March, the Ides of March. And they fell apart, I believe, at one point, including last year. Of course, Red Wings were also in a wild card position last year at the start of March, and then they lost a bunch of games last year. It's a rinse and repeat, deja vu all over again this year for the Detroit Red Wings and their fans, as I believe they're, prior to their most recent win last game, they were something like 1-12, 1-13 in this March and last March. So the most previous 2 Marches, they were 1-12, which is March is when games are important. April, May, June playoff games are important, but March regular season, probably maybe the most important month of the NHL calendar. You cannot be giving up games and going on losing streaks when you're in a playoff position. And the Red Wings have done just that, but they haven't fallen too far away from where the playoffs are no longer in reach. Of course, the Senators pretty handedly. This is much easier to explain with the graphics, so look on your screen. Of course, the staple of radio sports shows are the graphics. The Senators are at 75 points, handedly in the first wildcard spot in the East. Look at who can contend for that second and final wildcard spot in the East, currently being held by the Columbus Blue Jackets. Out of nowhere, Cinderella season, I'd really love to see Columbus make it. I think it'd be great. I like a lot of their players. And they've got that team where they're not an easy out. They can play hard. They play physical. And their tenacity is admirable. So the Blue Jackets, if they make the playoffs, they could be an upsetter and a bracket buster for some playoff brackets. Nonetheless, the Blue Jackets occupy that first Eastern Conference, that second Eastern Conference wildcard position with 70 points. So leaders at 70 points. Rangers, of course, tied with Blue Jackets, of course, falling due to the tiebreaker. So if the playoffs ended, it would be Blue Jackets going to the playoffs and the Rangers. But the Rangers are tied with the Blue Jackets at 70 points too. Rangers had the up and down, weirdest, wildest season of arguably any team not named the Vancouver Canucks this 24-25 year in the NHL. What a season. They're one of my favorites to make the playoffs. I've been a Rangers fan for a while. They're one of my favorite American teams, and they've had a strong team for a while, and I expect them to do a bit more damage in the playoffs or even make the playoffs this year. But they were way down the standings, but they've been able to kind of fight their way back up into the wild card conversation. Again, Blue Jackets lead that wild card, second wild card position, 70 points. Rangers also have 70 points. Canadiens, 69 points. Red Wings, 68 points. Bruins, 68 points. Islanders, 65 points. Still 5 points away. That's a several game win streak while other teams above you lose, drop 2 of 3 on a road trip. Islanders could be right back in this one. Islanders also have 2 games in hand on the wild card position. So, I remind you, for that last wild card position, you got the Blue Jackets, Rangers, Islanders, Canadiens, Red Wings, Bruins fighting for. That's 6 teams fighting for one playoff position. The Eastern Conference is wild. Coming in or going into the postseason, and it'll be quite a treat to watch how that shapes up. Of course, the NHL playoffs coming in about 18, 19, 20 games for most teams. It's a wide open playoff, and we'll get more conversation on that a bit later, of course, as the season goes on and the semester rolls on here on Gold and Bold, of course. That's national hockey. What about national basketball? Of course, Raptors moving their way up in the standings, which you like and you also don't really like. Of course, Raptors now find themselves 11th in the East out of the playoffs. They're only 348-point percentage. Nothing crazy. They're not going to be a postseason contender or anything like that. But they've been on a bit of a win streak, a bit of a heater. Of course, last 10, they're 6-4, and they're on a 2-game win streak now. But before that, before a couple losses, they're on a 3 or 4-game win streak too. So coming into March, they've really turned it on. And you like to see that for the young players on the Raptors rebuilding. You love to see it as a fan. You want to see your team win, do well, see the players excel. However, by climbing the standings, they're also climbing further away from number 1 overall draft pick, which, as the Raptors were expected, of course, to be at the bottom of the standings. Of course, heralded beginning of the season as ethical tankers. Of course, tanking, no team will admit to tanking, but tank is when a team, fields a roster that is typically pretty young, pretty inexperienced, and not very talented compared to the rest of the league. And they find themselves at the bottom of the standings to get that number 1 overall draft pick, or the best chance. The draft lottery, but the team with the worst team in the league has the best odds of getting the first overall pick in the upcoming draft. Now, the Raptors look like that was going to be their team. That was going to be, the season was a wash. That's what they'll go for. But it was called ethical tanking because Raptors still tried. They still put on a bench and a starting lineup that tried and was young, was exciting, was energetic. They wouldn't come away with a lot of wins, but it was good to see. They kept games close, and the players kept developing. And you could argue they're one of the more entertaining teams the first half of the league. And I'm not saying that as a Canadian bias. Americans were saying that too. They're Raptors. Oh man, this is a great Raptors team. That is the ethical tank, where you're at the bottom of the standings, but you're still trying and you're still competing with teams ahead of you, but you ultimately lose. The ethical tank. I like ethical tanks. That being said, the Raptors are no longer tanking. They're just being ethical. by winning games. Now, as a Raptors fan, you want them to get the best chance at a first overall pick. That being said, you also like them winning. So it's a double-edged knife. However, as I Google something real quick, I'm sure you can hear my clacking. However, of course, it does not look like the Raptors will be in that conversation to get that first overall pick anymore. You see the Wizards now at the bottom of the East. The Jazz, Utah Jazz, has not been very good at all this year, and Utah Jazz have had their struggles as of late. So have the Pelicans. They're among the bottom of the standings too. But you look at Pelicans, Jazz. You also look at 76ers, Brooklyn Nets, Hornets, and Wizards. That's 6 teams below the Raptors in the standings, which means that's 6 teams with better draft lottery odds than Toronto. Double-edged knife. You like to see the Raptors winning. You like to see their players improving. Especially the bench players have come off and onto the court really well. They've been effective. You're getting further away from what could be a franchise-changing first overall pick. Now, the players, no professional player, I don't like when people suggest this. No professional player doesn't, okay, I was going to say no professional player doesn't try. Of course, we've seen James Harden. But no professional, or Kyrie Irving and all of them, no professional player wants to lose or likes to lose. No professional player tries to lose. They may not try to their fullest effort. Especially in basketball, you might have some personality problems, lack of motivation. But no basketball player tries to lose. So the Raptors players, they're not going to care. They don't care where they are in the standings. They go out each game and they play to the best of their ability. If they win, great. If they lose, bad. The idea that professional players, throw games or try to lose to help their team, the standings, get a draft pick, that's ridiculous. You don't get to the professional leagues with that mindset. You don't get to professional sports being content with loss and trying to fail. No professional player does that. Professional players are guilty of not putting their most effort in. It's a different thing than not trying to your highest extent and trying to lose. So the Raptors players, they're not trying to lose. They're trying to win games. And they're doing half decently at that, of course, especially in this month and for the past month or so. But as they climb the standings, they get further away from good odds in the draft lottery. Now, the Raptors will still miss the playoffs. The Raptors will still get a top 10 draft pick, maybe top 5, depending on the rest of the season goes. But they're finding themselves further away from that number 1 overall draft pick. Of course, Raptors are not the only team in Toronto. We talked about the Leafs. We talked about the Raptors. Let's talk about the Blue Jays out of Dunedin, Florida. Spring training has started, and the team's not looking bad. And they never really look bad during spring training. They just look bad during the actual season. But Max Scherzer had to start a couple days ago. I enjoyed. He looked well. Of course, 40 years old. Max Scherzer, far removed from his years as an elite pitcher, Cy Young candidate, all that fun stuff. We didn't look bad at all. Of course, when he pitched 3 innings, I liked what he saw. I liked what I saw too. Of course, the Blue Jays have had wins against the likes of the Yankees. They had a bit of a series against the Detroit Tigers as well. I clack a bit more. Of course, they play tonight at 6 o'clock against the Houston Astros. Of course, and again, recently they've had wins against the likes of the Tigers, the likes of the Rays, likes of the Astros, likes of the Twins, likes of the Orioles. In fact, they've won most of their previous games. They're on a 5-game winning streak. And the 2 games before that, they only lost by 1 point. They lost to the Yankees 7-8. Lost against the Phillies 4-5. Lost against the Pirates 6-7. These are close games. Lost against the Phillies 4-5 again. So the Blue Jays showing real strength in this spring training out of Florida, of course, and still have a lot of games to go before the official start of the NBA, the MLB season. Of course, they play tonight against the Astros, play tomorrow against the Cardinals, and they have the Braves and the Phillies and the Yankees, Orioles, Rays, Phillies, Twins, of course, spring training. You have your group of main teams that you face against. AL or NL. Teams doesn't really matter. Of course, you see them facing off against the Pirates and stuff like that. Of course, they face off the Orioles for a 4-game series, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30th. And then the Nationals, 31st, 1st, 2nd, all that fun stuff to kick off the regular season. Of course, the Blue Jays have looked decent, and this is a make-or-break season for the Blue Jays. As Vladimir Guerrero, of course, we've covered on the show before, the Guerrero contract saga is wild. And we'll see where that goes. I do not foresee Guerrero sticking around with the Toronto Blue Jays, which hurts to say. I do not see Bo Bichette sticking around with the Toronto Blue Jays, which hurts to say. However, I was going to say something, I forgot. Quality radio content here. Guerrero's contract, Sega has been illustrated in color for the last 4 months across any publication. And it's a shame to see. And Guerrero's gone on interviews. Of course, I think it was Dominican Republican, so it was translated. Now, he was not asking for Juan Soto money. He was not asking for Shohei Ohtani money. In fact, I think he said it was at least over $100 million away from Soto's contract recently that the Mets signed. Of course, that was a big rumor. Of course, the Jays have been in on Ohtani. We were 1 plane ride away from having Shohei Ohtani, the greatest baseball player currently alive, on the Toronto Blue Jays. 1 plane ride away. That was a fun afternoon. And we were willing to shell out the big bucks. Rogers was willing to shell out the big bucks to try to attract Juan Soto to the Blue Jays. Rumor was $600 million contract to get Juan Soto. He eventually signs not with the Blue Jays. Seems like that's a constant through in most professional sports out of Toronto. They're always in on all these players. They never end up really getting these players. They're in. The Leafs, they're in on Marchand. They're in on Rantanen. We never really end up getting those players. Raptors seem to be in on some players. Never end up getting them. Do get Kawhi Leonard for a season, which was a breath of fresh air. Blue Jays are in on every baseball free agent. Never end up getting them. And if you're Guerrero, you see Juan Soto, one of the best players in the league, commands $600 million that your organization was willing to shell out. And Guerrero asks for, allegedly, this is not confirmed, but allegedly, for not even for less than that, for less than $600 million. He says $100 million away, so less than $500 million. Your organization's willing to shell out $600 million for Juan Soto, but they're not willing to shell out $480 for Vladimir Guerrero Jr., $450 maybe, $490, $475, somewhere in that range, I'd imagine. So Rogers was okay with the go-ahead of giving $600 million to Juan Soto, but they're not okay with giving $450 to Vladimir Guerrero. You can see why he'd be a bit upset with that. Now, this whole saga will be, come to light years later. But I'd put it around $450, $475 for Vladimir Guerrero Jr. And Blue Jays could not get it done. their management, who's been at the helm for far too long, after year of disappointments and wild card losses, not even making the playoffs last year. Atkins, Shapiro still at the head of the ship, somehow, some way. Someone has some blackmail there. And they don't get it done with Guerrero. Guerrero set a deadline for everyone to be comfortable with the contract talks for leaked into the season, and they cannot get it done. So Guerrero's on a contract for the remainder of the season, then he'll become a free agent. I don't see him sticking around at the Blue Jays. Not that that's a fault against Vladimir Guerrero as a person. I don't know the guy. I think it's just more of a fault for the Blue Jays and not being able to get it done. I've had zero faith in the management squad for a while here in the Toronto MLB organization. And it's just more, as a fan, you resign yourself to disappointment. I think it'll be a disappointing year for the Blue Jays. Spring training has been too disappointing. But spring training hasn't really been disappointing for the Blue Jays. It's the product on the field during the regular season and when it counts in August and September that has been disappointing. Be interesting to see where Guerrero goes. If he goes, I'm not saying it's certain. He might stay with the Blue Jays, and I won't say I'll eat my shoe again, because last time I said that, Marchand got traded. So I won't say I'll eat my shoe again. But I doubt that Guerrero will stick around. And if Guerrero goes, I see Bichette going, and now the Blue Jays are back where they started in 2020, trying to get young players. And the Blue Jays, it is known that they have one of the weakest developmental prospects in the league. It's known. You can Google it. I encourage you to. They're a bottom 5 league in developmental prospects. Bottom 5 team in the league in developmental prospects. So if Guerrero and Bichette don't turn out, and these franchise players they've hitched their wagon to don't turn out, and they pack up shop and leave the city, then you're right back where you started with a worse development pool. It may be a long time before the Blue Jays kind of get back to that contendership they were 10 years ago. Might be another 10 years. It'll be interesting to keep up with the Blue Jays this season and see where they go. If Guerrero goes, or Bichette goes, or they both go, it'll be interesting to see where they go. Of course, there's rumors of the Mets. There's rumors of the Yankees. There's rumors of the Red Sox. These storied franchises south of the border. The Red Sox, the Yankees, classics, the Mets. And you see them kind of going. I think that'd be attractive to Guerrero. They have the money to pay him. They have some strong teams. They have stronger teams than the Jays do. And you can see why that'd be an attractive option. All of that to say that spring training so far going pretty well for the Blue Jays. And they'll finish up March in spring training. And then April kind of kicks off the regular season in the MLB. And it'll be 162 games. And we'll, by the time late September rolls around next year, I'm previewing the season for the Blue Jays. By the time the season starts and ends, it will not be me previewing or recapping the season for the Blue Jays. It'll be a brand new Golden Bold host, brand new Golden Bold lineup. So, keep checking in until I dip and someone else picks it up. And we can kind of compare and contrast what I say at the start of the season to what the next hosts say about the season in September. That's fun. That's a good exercise for listeners. Of course, also in the news, we're going to go back to the OUA for a second because I forgot to do this at the start of the program. I had noted down too, and I didn't cover. I wanted to cover the OUA postseason, even though Luray is not in the postseason for women's hockey, men's basketball, men's basketball. Doesn't mean we still can't cover it, and I find it quite interesting because, again, as you cover a lot of these sports, as you commentate for all of these sports, you do get familiar with visiting teams, especially over the past couple of years, and it's interesting to see to pick up on how they are going. Of course, women's ice hockey, touched on it at the start of the program. The Waterloo Warriors, University of rivals, right down the street. I could practically see their campus from here. They are going to the McCaw Cup Finals. Second year in a row, it will be the Toronto Varsity Blues taking on the Waterloo Warriors. That game is just one game. Rest of the postseason, OUA women's hockey, it's best of 3. No. OUA McCall Cup Championship Women's Hockey Glory for Ontario University Athletics. One game. One final. 4 p.m. tomorrow, and that's at Waterloo. That's at the Columbia Ice Fields. That's at home for the Waterloo Warriors. No, you get home ice advantage, but you got all your fans coming in, and they're probably, all Waterloo fans. They're probably not all Toronto fans. They're also just hockey fans. Seeing local hockey at this stage, OUA Championships just down the street. There's going to be a great crowd for that. Of course, it comes on St. Patrick's Day weekend, but it's at 4 p.m. So you can kind of, it's tomorrow, Saturday. You can kind of, maneuver your schedule around that game. Make sure you go out and watch it, or stay in and throw it on OUA TV and watch it as the Waterloo Warriors take on the visiting Toronto Varsity Blues. Of course, Toronto Varsity Blues handling the Guelph Griffins in the OUA semifinals, and the Waterloo Warriors making to the finals for second year in a row. Of course, the reigning McCall Cup champions. The Waterloo Warriors in Game 2 of the OUA semifinal went to 2 overtimes, finally besting the Nipissing Lakers. So, tough semifinals for both these teams. Waterloo besting Nipissing, Toronto besting Guelph. For Waterloo and Toronto facing off in the OUA Women's Hockey Championships. Men's hockey, of course, Laurier didn't even appear in. Of course, they're at the bottom of the West, and a very disappointing season for the men's hockey program here at Laurier. Looking to rebound next year, of course, in the finals for the Queen's Cup, OUA men's hockey glory. It is TMU taking on Concordia, and that will be played also tomorrow at 6:15 p.m. So you're going to get to watch the women's and then the men's. Look at that. I love the scheduling. And it will be hosted by TMU at the ice fields in Toronto. Of course, TMU besting Toronto. Their Toronto rivals besting U of T Varsity Blues in the OUA semifinals in Game 3 by a score of just 2-1. So best of 3 goes all the way to 3. And the TMU win by 1 goal. Heartbreaker for the Varsity Blues, and a chance to win the Queen's Cup for the Toronto Metropolitan Blues. Of course, TMU bested UFT, as I mentioned, and Concordia to make a date with the TMU in the finals. Concordia beats Queens in 2 games. Both, again, also 1-goal games, shutting out Queens 1-0 in Game 2 of the semifinal matchup between the two schools, and then Concordia beating Queens in the first game 2-1. Tight matchup here. You expect probably a 1-goal game, as each team's semifinals were decided by a 1-goal game. You expect a 1-goal game coming out of tomorrow's matchup for OUA Men's Hockey Championships. The bronze medal, of course, played by the losing side of the semifinals, Toronto Varsity Blues and the Queens Gales. Flipping over to basketball. Of course, the basketball finals already in. Of course, it's the Ottawa GGs. Women's and men's basketball championships. Of course, this news coming last weekend. Of course, March the 8th. Wilson Cup for men's basketball. Ottawa GGs disposed of the Queens Gales 95-87 at home. Again, also a 1-game final. And women's basketball, of course, the GGs solving the Carleton Ravens in the Critelli Cup for women's basketball glory of the OUA. Ottawa GGs 70, Carleton Ravens 61. Of course, Laurier did make an appearance in women's basketball, but just like the women's hockey, they're out in round 1, and both losses for the Golden Hawks, they beat themselves. It was heartbreaking. Of course, Laurier losing in 2 in a best-of-3 series to the Waterloo Warriors, including an overtime loss in the first game, and then just beating themselves in the second game. All the Warriors had to do was just play a consistent, barely above average game, and Laurier Golden Hawks did the rest for them as they led in 2 shorthanded goals in a must-win game. heartbreaking for women's hockey and heartbreak for women's basketball as they lost 56-71 in that first round against the Guelph Griffins, which, all right, you lose by 15. All right, well, Griffins are a stronger team. Nothing too crazy to write home about. Golden Hawks were winning at the half by 5 or 6 points. But has been a storyline throughout the entire season, as we mentioned on the show time and time again, as I think Connor had a rant about. The Golden Hawks continue to find ways to lose when they're winning. They cannot hold on to a lead. They have barely held on to a lead all season. If they had been able to hold on to multi-point leads coming out of the half, they would have been a much higher-seeded team. This team had strength. This team was good. Cassie Hurdle, Kate White, Jaden Engie. These good players, great core roster players. And they're just not able to hold on to the league. So while the men's teams of basketball and hockey didn't even make a playoff appearance, the women's teams did. However, they did end up besting themselves, really, in the first round of the OUA playoffs. Of course, again, to reiterate, Ottawa GGs, out of the nation's capital, winning men's and women's basketball championships. Of course, to get to that point, of course, on the women's side, the GGs beat the Lancers by nearly 30 points in the semifinal to move on to the finals, which they ultimately won. And the Ravens beat TMU by 16 points, 76-60, to move on to eventually become the silver medalists against the gold medalists. The GGs men's basketball, the GGs beat TMU by over 30 points now, by 33 points. The men's basketball semifinals to move on to the finals. And the Gales, very close score, hang on by a fingernail by 2 points. That's one basket, 64-62 over Ontario Tech to make it to the Wilson Cup final for men's basketball, where they ultimately lose by 8 against the champions, Ottawa GGs. As we wrap out this episode of Gold and Bold, of course, a great week in sports across the OUA. Of course, the basketball championships were decided this past weekend, and we have the men's and women's hockey championships yet to be decided. They'll both be decided tomorrow. Of course, women's hockey championships being held at Waterloo Warriors, and Laurier, where I would normally not shout out you Waterloo, but I will because they're hosting. Not only are they playing in the game, but they're hosting the game, so it's right down the street. Get your tickets before they sell out for OUA Women's Hockey Championships. I know tomorrow is a big deal for a lot of post-secondary campuses. Of course, St. Patrick's Day weekend, so, party responsibly, stay safe. I'm not your dad, I'm not your parents, but, you guys are old enough to make your own decisions. Be smart about it. Or don't. Darwinism, really. Survival of the fittest. And with that, I will bid you adieu. From the Radio Laurier studio, of course, keep Radio Laurier on. As, of course, we will have Film Score Fridays, I'm fairly sure, coming up after, which is always really interesting discussion, especially if you're a music fan, just analyzing film scores, story behind them, how they're integrated into movies, and hearing them is always a great joy, especially if you find movies, music interesting. So make sure you tune in for that. I'm fairly sure that occurs after this program, just a bit after 2. And make sure to tune in next week for the next edition of Gold and Bold. Hopefully I'll have some co-hosts back for that. If not, it will just be my voice again. Of course, I was running a bit of a cold, so my voice is probably a bit lower than I'm used to. So that means, my voice is a bit deeper. So I was more of a man this episode. We'll see if it returns next week. And with that, bid you a great afternoon, great rest of your weekend. Be responsible. Use some critical thinking over this weekend. And we'll see you next week at 1 p.m. next Friday for the next edition of Gold and Bold. Have a great weekend, everyone, and have a great St. Patrick's Day.